More now with Bob Zoellick, president of the World Bank. He did speak at the UN yesterday. I want to ask you about this broader global growth narrative. You're just back from China. What was your sense in talking with Chinese officials about the sense of themselves in the world in terms of the role in rebalancing global trade and interest in perhaps moving on the currency front?
Well, I was in Beijing, Shanghai, but also Guizhou province in the southwest, a very poor province. And the one thing that united everywhere is these people are building. I mean, there's a real sense of commitment, energy, different challenges, different parts of the country. On the issue of rebalancing, they recognize this as an issue, in part for their own interest. So they've had export-led growth. It's had some industry concentration, but it's not going to be easy. So this is in part trying to increase their consumption as opposed to their savings, but it's also changing some of the industrial structure for the future.
But on the currency front, it seems to get a whole lot of attention here in the United States. When it comes to China's own efforts to cool its growth off a little bit, where does the appreciation of the yuan fall in terms of what they actually need to do and have incentive to move on in the immediate?
Well, because they have restricted the appreciation of the yuan, that limits the effect of their monetary policy. They drive their monetary policy to keep that exchange rate. So one of the arguments of why this would be in China's own interest to do some appreciation, it was to give more freedom for their monetary policy, like the Federal Reserve does. But more generally, the appreciation of a currency is just a price signal about different exchange rates between different currencies. And that would be important to signal the direction of less export-led growth and more domestic demand. But the underlying structural changes, some of which you referred to on the industrial side, have to also be done. It won't just be done by the appreciation. And so one of the reactions you get from the Chinese is a number of them, the reformers, know they need to appreciate, but they also have to focus on these structural rebalancing issues. And we're trying to help them with that at the World Bank.
Susan Schwab, former U.S. Trade Ambassador, was on this program. You're very familiar with the concerns of that office, and she said that labeling China a currency manipulator, quote, doesn't do anyone any good. Do you agree with that title as an effective tool?
Well, these get caught into U.S. politics, and so it becomes, in some sense, a mano a mano thing. Are you willing to say this or that? It will certainly just antagonize the Chinese, and if you think that antagonizing them will get them to act more, well, that's your judgment call. My own sense is that it's important to continue to put pressure on them, explain how it's in a common interest, but I'm not sure that just calling one term from a piece of legislation. How would Americans feel if the Chinese did that? So this is where the balancing that the administration, the Congress have has to be finally done. Yeah,
and a large part of that narrative has to do with the joblessness here in the United States, and the two issues have been linked there. Ambassador Schwab suggested that the Obama administration had pulled its punches a little bit on this issue. Is there a benefit here, more of a benefit, to seeing a weak yuan in that it helps keep consumer prices low in the United States?
Well, certainly the Chinese exports end up lowering prices, and often for people at the low-income side. My own sense is that if they weren't Chinese goods, they'd like to be goods in a number of these sectors from other poor countries. I mean, if you're talking about apparel and textiles, most of those businesses are overseas. I do think the appreciation is appropriate, and I think the Chinese are going to move into a value-added approach. I think the question is how they accomplish it, how you press them, and also what the U.S. has to do. Remember, rebalancing is also a question of U.S. savings and consumption, and that also goes to some of the budget issues here.
Very quickly before we go, I want to ask you about Europe, because there are questions once again about the sovereign debt crisis there. Do you think the worst is behind us?
I hope so. I think the Europe has united in a way of trying to deal with some of the downside risk. But again, a lot of this goes to the fundamentals. The fundamentals of how these countries got in that position still have to be addressed.
Well, with the issue of Ireland in particular and a default on that front, it wasn't ruled out by the EC president.
Well, it's also Greece and others. I think the Europeans are going to strike very hard to avoid defaults. But the fundamental budgetary questions that got you into here, some of the demographics, how they're going to restructure their spending and others. Look, Germany's done a very good job on this. Germany, understandably, then says, well, why should we pay for younger retirement ages elsewhere? Those are some of the issues that are going to have to be addressed there, but also, frankly, in the U.S.
All right. Thank you for your time. Covered a lot of issues with you today. Appreciate it.
You bet.